Joining. Off we go.
Thank you. So glad to be here and so glad that you are all here with me. So today we're going to be talking about silencing stigma and understanding the presence in schools around substance use. So you may be wondering what I bring to the table. I do teach an adjunct professor here at Plymouth State University. I teach the addictions and related disorders as part of the clinical mental health counseling program. But before that, I've worked an extensive amount of I'm in substance use treatment and mental health in the community. I specialized my education in that before working in the field. So I've worked in just about every aspect of substance use treatment. I often joke that the only piece that I haven't done is methadone maintenance. And that's just because those clinics usually start at 5 a.m. and that is just a very early start for me. So I've got a lot of experience in working with substance use and wanting to bring that to you to talk about. So one of the early questions are, why are substances used, right? There's kind of a lot of stigma around who uses, why they use, lots of questions. And I'd like to start that off with just a little infographic that I found from Australian Geographic. Now, granted, most of us are not going to be able to ever see any of this in person, but they made a really great graphic for the purpose of slides. The concept behind it is that it's not unique to humans. We see it in pretty much all animals. Um, the desire to feel different, to feel altered. And there's some pretty exotic stuff here in this infographic, but more locally, you're probably familiar with videos of moose getting drunk off of fermented apples, squirrels doing the same thing. YouTube is riddled full of these. Even more locally, I'm guessing there's a lot of cat owners in the room. And how many of us, intoxicate our cats with catnip? And YouTube is also very fond of those videos. Big cats respond the same way, right? Lions, tigers, and they're very fond of doing so. Now, those come with, of course, a very low risk, not the stuff that we are typically talking about when we talk about substance use in humans. But even if it's not a substance, we still like feeling different, feeling a little bit different than we are, whether that is trying to cope after a long day. Anybody who's ever come home and had a pint of ice cream, pretty effective in changing feelings, right? Um, Coming home and having a couple glasses of wine, we start talking about substance use. But it's bigger than that. There's sometimes the novelty alone of, I wonder what that feels like, or it just feels silly or different. Anybody who's ever put their tongue on a 9-volt battery, spun yourself silly in a desk chair, right? Horror movies, roller coasters. We like feeling different. And that creates curiosity about what other ways could I feel different. Although sometimes it builds tolerance, right? Scarier movies, more extreme roller coasters. We see that with substances too. Now, like I said, there's low risk when we talk about something like catnip. When we talk about substance use, we see a lot more concern about risk with things like fentanyl. But the basic gist of it is weighing out perceived benefit versus perceived risk. And we all do this and take risks that we feel like maybe aren't that significant. My best example of this are cotton swabs, right? There's a warning right on the label. Don't put it in your ear, right? We hear things like, you should never put anything smaller than your elbow in your ear. Um, there's a risk of having a burst eardrum. Now, I suspect all of us, if not most of us, frequently put cotton swabs in our ears, right? We see this warning and it's like, well, I've been putting in cotton swabs my entire life. I've never burst my eardrum. I don't know anybody who has burst their eardrum, right? And the more that we have these experiences where harm didn't happen, and we don't know somebody personally where harm happened, or maybe even we discount it if we do know. It's like, oh, they weren't being careful like I'm, right? These are some of the concepts around perceived risk compared to the perceived benefit, right? There's a reason why we put cotton swabs in our ears. It feels good. Nothing else feels like that. It's quick, it's fast, it has a feeling that you can't replicate in any other way, right? Scratches that itch, cleans effectively, uh, pretty reliable in the efficacy and pleasure of it. So we weigh that out. Not that we're sitting around doing pros cons lists by any stretch, but we know what it feels like. We know we're going to feel better if we use a cotton swab in our ear versus I've never seen this happen. I'm going to dismiss this, or what's the worst that can happen? Like that's maybe a repairable injury. So we do these things on a regular basis. When it comes to substance use, there comes more stigma around why people are doing that, what kind of person does that. And it gets separated from the idea that we do this with all sorts of things. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're all guilty of this process in varying degrees. So when we're talking about substance use in schools, what are we talking about? And the statistics, according to the National Survey on Drug Use, these are from 2022. It takes a while to gather the data, package it up, and put it out. The data for 2023 will be available next year. This year's will be available 2023. So they break it down in different categories, ranging a little bit, because with alcohol, we're looking at the statistics saying age 12 to 20. And granted, most of you are not going to have 20-year-old students in your classes, but if you're kind of, you know, sorry, um, your students have a wide range of siblings, right? So they may have older siblings, or some of your older students may have friends that are in the 18, 19, 20 category that have graduated, but the friendships were developed while they were younger in high school, or even before that. So a lot of attention gets paid to fentanyl and a lot of education and warnings and prevention efforts because of the risk is so much higher. But statistically, the substances that we see most commonly is alcohol first and foremost, right? 15% of students are using alcohol, and that's a significant number. That is, of course, any alcohol use in the past month, which provides for a great range of what that may look like. That may be a one-time use, that could be a daily use, that all gets encapsulated into that 15%. The rates of binge use in the past month were half that. And binge use is typically about 5 drinks in one setting. So that is a pattern that is designed to feel altered, to feel intoxicated, and typically to get to that point as quickly as possible. And it's not just 5 drinks, right? 5 drinks or more. And marijuana, of course, is getting the second place there with 11.5%. Age 12 to 17, nicotine 6.9%, and it goes down from there. Typically, the higher percentage rates that we see, those are based on availability, right? Alcohol is in a lot of homes and easily accessible. Many students will know what convenience stores are going to be selling to underage and not carding. Same thing with nicotine, right? Word gets around pretty quick. We do have a liquor enforcement office here in New Hampshire. If anybody's ever seen its mascot, the Investigator, but they don't get to police as much as, you know, may be desirable. So students know, students talk, or they have a friend or family member that can purchase for them. We often think about those older friends, older siblings, but there are going to be, parents sometimes purchasing for their kids. The idea of some sort of harm reduction, that if they're trying it in my home, I can monitor them, I can keep them safe, they're not out on the street, they're not striving, those kinds of things. So accessibility is pretty big. I see some questions occasionally popping up in chat. Feel free to interrupt. I will address questions as we go. We don't have to wait till the end. So marijuana, nicotine, inhalants are, kind of the spray paints, spray deodorants. Every home has something that can be abused by inhaling. And it's really hard to completely eradicate your home of those options to make it a safe and protective environment. But even then, you know, if somebody is at a different home, visiting other family members, friends, those kinds of things. And a lot of times when we're talking about students, we think about prescription stimulants, the Adderall. There are a fair amount of students who are prescribed it for therapeutic use due to ADHD, whether they're borrowing from a friend or they're doubling up their own use, crushing, snorting, those kinds of misuse patterns that are not therapeutic. We know that it happens, but it is the minority of the students who are using it or prescribed it. Um, Keeping in mind too, sometimes students will share their prescriptions even though not supposed to.
One question did come up, if you don't mind me
Yeah.
interrupting. And effectively, it's simply, have we seen an increase in marijuana use since New Hampshire allowed the medical use exemption? Did that increase things at all in New Hampshire? Or reduce? Or either way?
Right. Um, Off the top of my head, I'm not really recalling the laws around medical use because I suspect it's 18 and above. And a lot of the data that we drive around that is adult focused. So that is hard to gauge. I can say that most states, when they have passed full legalization of recreational marijuana use, there's initially a decline in adolescent use of marijuana. It does pick up after a couple of years. There's some idea that trial of substances could be part of that very appropriate developmental stage of rebellion and trial. Um, and the perception that it's now safe and legal sucks some of the fun out of it. But it is important to recognize that legalization is not endorsement of safe use. Um, Alcohol is arguably one of the most dangerous substances, if not the most dangerous substance. We don't have great data that encapsulates all of the medical impact, people who are dying of gastrointestinal cancers, accidents, driving under the influence, all of those into one pot of data. But it would far surpass something like fentanyl, which gets far more attention. So alcohol is legal and not safe. So not safe for everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's a difficult piece, all of it. There's so many different, it's all intertwined. There's so much there. Thanks.
If there is. And students are trying to figure out what all that information means. And does it apply to me? Is it just a statistic, right? As are some adults, right? What does all of that mean? But primarily when it comes to substances of use in school age folks, it's accessibility. So how do we pick up that maybe somebody is using? We look for things like mood changes. That could be related to the effects of the substance. It could be related to coming off of a substance, not sleeping because of something that they used that kept them up, right? Just a lot of different attitude around, their participation, their engagement with other people, um, and defensiveness, particularly if you start seeing things like missing classes, grades decreasing, if you express concern and very quick to fire back an explanation, um, accusations of feeling picked on, those kinds of things. And substance use can often result in feeling very kind of poorly mentally and physically. So that kind of goes along with that. And an increase in problematic behaviors or disregard for school rules could be things like being disruptive to other students, not following expectations like using a phone in class, being very challenging about the rules, like why is that the rule, more so than maybe other students. Changes to memory or concentration, whether that's because they're coming to class under the influence or again, just really tired or distracted, thinking about what's going to happen when they go home. We look for kind of physical changes, oftentimes like affected eyes. Now, different substances will affect that in different ways, but there's also other explanations for what can affect that too, right? Allergies can lead to bloodshot eyes. Changes in pupils could be the lighting or kind of coming in from the outside, or vice versa. Lack of coordination or slurred speech, indicating more of being under the influence, and changes to friendship, particularly if there are students that who have been struggling with substance use and somebody is building a new friendship with them. That would be a big warning sign. So none of these stand alone all by themselves as saying, well, this student doesn't seem to be concentrating as much, they're not paying as much attention. Maybe this is what it is. It's kind of a little bit of a flag to keep an eye on what's happening, what might be the explanation. Now, if you see all of these, probably far more likely. We also want to consider, is there substance use in their home? Maybe the student isn't, but a parent, a sibling, other family members that are staying with them, um, any other grown-ups that are responsible for their care. You're going to see a lot of the same kind of symptoms: difficulty focusing, increased anger, missing school. A lot of what you'll see are the signs that you're already looking for around abuse and neglect, right? Particularly if a caregiver is using to the point that they can't get the students to school, can't get them up and going in the morning, those kinds of things, coming to school without their homework, lunch packed, those kinds of things, right? Seeing those changes. It's also important to recognize the statistics of how many kids have now lost a parent and how grief really impacts their ability to focus and engage in school. And when we talk about stigma, recognizing that it has really impacted some students and being very kind about sort of what that means for them. Missing school, I had mentioned. Oh, yeah, Jeremy.
Well, you can tell when I pop right up in there. But another question comes out and it relates to this slide. Darn it, if teachers aren't doers and want to get stuff done. When they notice or believe that a student might be in their class that is living in a situation with active substance abuse, what things can that teacher do? I mean, beyond the obvious of reporting a suspicion, etc. But what could a student do to assist a student in that situation?
Certainly if you're looking for additional information, some soft questions of, hey, what happened today? No accusations. Sometimes uh, did mom forget today? Can come with more defensiveness versus a more open approach. Um, and certainly collaborating with like school social workers, school counselors, because they may already be kind of involved or on the radar. And so having that wraparound approach as much as possible is really helpful. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much. Always, we wanted to be able to do something, even if it's something very tiny. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Um, and I was going to say, missing school, well, sometimes there's difficulties getting out the door in the morning, difficulties with transportation. But looking at that statistic about how many kids have lost a parent, we do see kids being fearful of leaving their home because they have a family member that has maybe been hospitalized, had the emergency room or 911 called, and they're not looking great this morning. And I'm afraid to leave them home alone because if something happens while I'm not here because I'm at school, what happens? Right. So we have kids who are a little bit more vigilant about maintaining the safety of their loved ones, whether that's a parent, a sibling, somebody else in the home. There's a lot of responsibility, a lot of weight that they're carrying. So, what are the trends? What are we seeing? I talked about statistics, right? Who's using how much they're using. Um, but where do students find information? What information is out there? A big one that we're talking about these days is counterfeit pills. So the idea that fentanyl has largely replaced heroin on the street, we are aware of that. A lot of people are like, that's kind of all it is. I'm not buying anything in a powder. But for students who are using something other than opiate, right? Maybe they're trying to find another source for something like Adderall or even benzodiazepines. We do see kind of more kind of older students looking for things like Xanax, Klonopin. I may have heard them talking about this. It's getting more complicated though, because increasingly we have people that have very high tech pill presses and punches and dyes that can make pressed fentanyl look so much like another substance. So as you can see here, it's very convincing what an Adderall or a fake Adderall pill looks like compared to the authentic. The DEA has this warning campaign, one pill can kill, trying to get that information out there. But it's so convincing that, you know, these federal agents who specialize in this still have to do field testing. Um, and your average student is not going to be able to tell the difference. So recognizing the lethality of fentanyl and how very potent it is, particularly if a student has not been using opiates, there's no tolerance built up, there's a far greater risk of losing their life. And so providing some of that education, being aware of the kind of the duping process of this, that they may feel like they trust the person that they're getting from, and that person may trust the person they're getting it from. So there can be some sharing that is far riskier than what they think they're kind of signing up for, right? That perceived risk versus perceived benefit. Like, I know that this person wouldn't do me wrong. People don't always know what they're getting. But this is one of the kind of upfront and center concerns that we've been talking about. You may have also heard of the amount of drugs that are being tampered with or laced with fentanyl. So, um, if a student starts to experiment with something like cocaine, there's also been more fentanyl in that. There are a lot of rumors around fentanyl being in marijuana, and there's really no evidence to support that. That is largely a rumor. Even if it were, the process of using it would not make the fentanyl viable for a high. So, for example, if it's in a joint, the process of burning it would disintegrate the fentanyl. So that wouldn't really work. It's also really not cost effective for dealers. Fentanyl's a lot more expensive than it is to sell weed. Um, so it's important to know what we're dealing with and what's out there and having accurate information. But recognizing the lethality, we have more conversations about Narcan and having it available, having people know how to use it. So your school very likely has Narcan on site now, whether it's in every classroom, whether it's with the school nurse, knowing where it is, who has it, how to access it is really important. Um, Increasingly, we encourage people, just average people, to carry it at all times. You know, we often think about people who have CPR training and the idea of being a good Samaritan, that you're up to date on your training, you're available to save a life whenever possible. And there are laws that protect if there's any sort of negative outcome. You crack a rib, for example, or if the person doesn't actually get revived from CPR, right? Because we're not all health professionals. Same thing for Narcan. Same laws protect. You don't have to be a medical professional. So much so that you have a picture here of a fairly small student. This is from a 2020 article in the New York Times about schools teaching students to use Narcan in Tennessee. The opiate epidemic was much higher there than other parts of the country and very similar to teaching kids how to call 911. They were being taught and given access to Narcan to take home, to have available. And this may be something that your students are familiar with and have available at home and know how to use and maybe have had to and had to engage in some of those life-saving efforts. So certainly. And I know schools are, you know, really strict about not having medications on a student, wanting to make sure that self-controlled and on the up and up and approved. You may find that students are carrying because they're concerned about a friend. They've had to use it at home. They always have it on them. So that could be something that gets talked about where it becomes known. And looking at the statistics, talked about nicotine and vaping was huge, huge problem in schools. And students were really getting more and more creative about ways of hiding it. Um, the smells or the fragrance of vaping was also kind of easier to hide what was happening. But Zens are even more discreet than vaping. And so they've been getting far more popular, particularly with the fun flavors, right? Anytime we see like fun flavors, whether it's vaping, Zen, alcohols, right? There's a lot of flavors that are really questionably marketed, and it's kind of obvious that it's attracting adolescent or underage use. Zens are a little bit more complicated than just the idea of availability, because certainly this is easily disguised. The tends to look very similar to a lot of breath mints tends, right? Like breath savers. Um, but nicotine easily disguised in the mouth. It's not as obvious of a pouch as it is like chewing tobacco, which creates a visible bulge. So very discreet, very easy to access, to use. But we've also been seeing a shortage. It's been getting harder and harder to find it. Um, so there's a little bit of exclusivity that can come with having them these days. Um, Somewhat similar to having the hot new sneakers. So keeping that in mind, does this, you know, become something that brings a little prestige or an elevated status among other students, right? Kind of builds popularity in a way. Um, so increasingly you hear about this. It is certainly a hot new trend. Where do students find out about all this, right? If you thought TikTok, you're right. It's a lot of TikTok. And we see a lot of news articles about how those trends come about. There's silly dance trends that are very benign, and then there are the more harmful ones. Right? When we have videos that are touting the silliness or ridiculousness of what people look like when they're under the influence of something like laughing gas, for example. It looks fun. It looks silly. It doesn't look dangerous, right? These are short videos without any explanation, any warnings, any research or explanation about what could happen or the dangers of doing that outside of a controlled environment. It's one thing to do it at the dentist's office where it's controlled. It's another thing to get your hands on it at home. And looking at things like, this headline here about chroming. Chroming is the new word for huffing or inhaling use. A lot of repackaged ideas. So it sounds certainly a little fancier than terminology that I grew up with, which can also breed some of that idea of exclusivity or popularity. Um, Very accessible. But that also kind of goes into the idea that you got to know what they're talking about, right? Students and lingo and slang changes on a near daily basis. It is really hard to keep up with what does that word mean? What are they talking about? There is no shame in Googling it. Figure out what are they talking about. Um, Even sometimes asking some of those questions around that's a new term. Um, can you tell me more? But it's not just TikTok. We have those kind of videos, those short pieces. There's more information on YouTube, much more, have a longer format. One of the big trends last year was the blackout rage gallon, which provided a lot of misinformation. There was this idea that if you took a gallon jug, did half water, half Gatorade, maybe, and half vodka or alcohol of your choice, that it was mixed with something hydrating, so you wouldn't be as hungover the next day. But that's still half a gallon of 40 proof or higher. So a lot of the information was touting the benefits and the reduced risk without explanation of what consuming that amount of alcohol actually does to the body. We have sites like Reddit, which provide very detailed information about how to use, what to use, where to obtain. Um, so even if somebody doesn't know personally somebody that is using a particular substance, it is very easy to get that information to communicate with other people who are using it and increase access and availability. So certainly the internet makes that the social group so much bigger. The information's out there and the information's not always accurate. The information is not always safe information. And students don't always have great media literacy. How do you determine what is actual legit information that they should be concerned about versus kind of fear mongering? Hard to tease that out for most kids. So why are we concerned about this besides, the lethality of some substances? There are lots of concerns around decreased grades, projected futures, relationships with friends and family. There's a lot of impact to substance use, but there's a lot of impact to the brain. Right? When we talk about the frontal lobe not fully developing until like 26, 28, that's where all the decision making, the weighing out of pros, cons, being able to anticipate consequences, that's still forming. So it's a little bit harder to weigh those kind of facts out. And you see more impulsivity. Very appropriate for where the brain is at in the developmental stage. But it's a little fragile in some ways. Right? So looking at adolescent alcohol exposure, we have found that there are long-lasting effects on cognitive ability, primarily in kind of the deficits in recall of an extinguished fear response. What that means is the brain forgets last time you were worried about an exam, you were able to cope with it and got through it and survived it. It forgets that and replaced with you're not able to cope with that. That is too scary. You're going to have to do something different to get through it, like alcohol. Remember when alcohol made it a little bit easier to get through? And it starts to form more of those memories that it's not possible to cope and get through. This creates anxiety, as we know, and kind of diagnose it. And it persists into adulthood, along with reducing working memory. So it gets harder and harder to remember those things. So, this isn't necessarily something that is, very limited alcohol use. Certainly, the more that a student uses alcohol, the greater risk that you're going to see with that. Similarly, nicotine is often kind of talked about with, well, it helps me focus. I feel so much more focused with nicotine. When we test it, it doesn't shake out. There's a perceived improvement in performance, but it actually worsens attentional performance. And that also persists into adulthood, which is one of the reasons why it is so very addictive, right? If somebody stops using and they notice that difference, like, oh, well, I've got to start using again because I couldn't get through this otherwise. And cannabis between the ages of 12 and 18 is more associated with the early onset schizophrenia. We do see a little bit more symptoms of psychosis. So typically schizophrenia is between the kind of early mid 20s. Now we're seeing it in 15, 16-year-olds with hospitalization. It is important to recognize that that is primarily around the very high potency stuff. So when we talk about the concentrates, dabs, shatter, those kinds of things, and less so the gummies, smoking a bowl that has a lower risk. Not immune, but there is impact to the brain. So what do we do? And we talked a little bit about what's being used, why people use, what the trends are. How do we support students? One of the best recommendations is to focus on health and brain science, not morality. Certainly, I grew up in the 90s DARE era, where there was a lot of language around, winners don't do drugs. Well, the default messaging for that is that losers do drugs. And that fosters a lot of poor self-esteem. Um, it doesn't provide any sort of information to really work with other than you're going to think poorly of me if I use. And what does that mean? So more of the impact around health and brain science, more factual information that will get you much further, will build more respect for the information that you provide versus discounting. I use DARE as an example. We used DARE for decades without ever testing its efficacy. Just assume that it worked because we were telling kids like how scary it is. Turns out it didn't help. It didn't reduce any sort of rates, and in some capacity seemed to increase rates of use. Definitely didn't work. We want to foster relationships with students, get involved with student organizations if possible. Being familiar to your students, that they can see that you are somebody that they could go to if they need support, or that you would be a person who could help them get the support they need, get the services, get the connections, versus a lecture, for example. So certainly, I don't have to tell you all how very important those teacher mentor roles are. You see how you shape your students. We think about our own kind of fondness for particular teachers and what they did for our lives. You're kind of doing the same for the next generation. And collaborating with school social workers and counselors. Now, some of that is, of course, providing those referrals, but just being familiar with them and having the ability where you feel comfortable kind of going to one and saying, I'd like to pick your brain, right? Maybe I'm seeing one warning sign. I'm not really sure. Do you guys know about something else? What should I be looking out for? Where should I make the referral? What do you think? And having those more unofficial conversations to really help support students even more.
You have a question that kind of lines up with where you are right now. Um, do you have any advice on how teachers or administrators could more effectively communicate with families about substance use issues without stigmatizing or alienating them? How does one communicate the concern without getting that defensive, we're not going to help you out response, I suppose?
It feels like such a loaded question. Um, Keeping in mind something like the substances that are more concerning, around like fentanyl and cocaine, those are more likely to be used by students if it's already in the home because that has access. But especially things like marijuana and alcohol, being in the home, having greater access is really what fosters it with students. So sometimes when you go to a family and say, I'm concerned about the student's substance use, they can become defensive because they're using too. So that is something to keep in mind, that you don't necessarily have all of the information about why they're so defensive. And not necessarily your responsibility to know all of that either. But I want to say that to kind of point out that it's not always how you say it, it's kind of what you're sometimes unknowingly poking. But certainly in just a slide or two, I talk a little bit about changing the language. I'm going to come back to that, but I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. It was a doozy. Thanks.
Yes. Next slide. Stigma is hard, right? We have a lot of data to support the idea that negative stereotypes, particularly about people with substance use disorders, makes them feel even worse. It makes it much harder to reach out. It makes it much harder to ask for help. When you hear people using harmful language about who that kind of people are, And then realizing I'm that kind of people. What does that mean? Right? I don't want you to think lots of me. I don't want you to call me those names. It gets harder to admit it and to ask for help. So increasingly, we look at changing how we talk about it and moving away from some of the old language that is still very well known and very common, but moving towards, a person with a substance use disorder. And that is a diagnostic criteria that is um, without having that diagnosis from a mental health professional or medical professional, we limit it more to a person who's using, has use of substance. We don't even use the term abuse anymore because that gets a little fuzzier too, right? It feels a little bit more of an inclination towards a behavior that is more willful versus kind of more that medical model that we tend to follow these days of drugs hijack the brain and it makes it harder for it to be a choice versus I can't cope without this. Um, moving away from language about somebody being clean, right? That clean, dirty dichotomy there versus abstinent. They're not using, they're in recovery. They're working on developing greater coping strategies, right? Kind of more of what are they doing to support their goals? How are they moving forward? But it gets bigger than that too. We often think about other aspects, whether somebody is unhoused, right? Um, there's a lot of stigma that comes with homeless. And particularly in today's economy, it's getting harder and harder to afford housing costs. So we have more students that maybe don't know where they're staying tonight, or it's a different family member, different week. And who is responsible for their care? Using terms like who are your grown-ups, who your responsible adult, um, versus did your parents, did you talk to your parents about this? Well, maybe they're not in the care of their parents anymore. Maybe they've lost a parent. If there's a history of substance use in the family, so it gets trickier. But using supportive language goes so far. And students see that and they hear that and they respect it. And we want to make sure that the information that we provide is accurate, not those kind of urban legends and kind of that scare tactic of, don't you know that this could be very harmful? I have a little graphic here about Halloween candy because it's the season, right? Happens every year. There's all these Facebook forwards. Um, like, candy look, fentanyl looks just like some candies. First and foremost, we don't really have any documented cases of this happening. Drugs are really expensive. People go to great lengths to find money to afford to purchase it. It's not getting handed out for free in kids can trick or treat bags. And this one particularly got me. It's like, who hands out loose candy? um, but that media literacy. This particular graphic was posted by a police department, not a New Hampshire police department. I want to specify that, but a police department. So it came with seeming authority, right? These are the experts. They know what's out there, but it wasn't accurate, right? So instead of kind of these kind of scary stories versus this really is happening, right? More focus on things like the one pill can kill campaign. And it is never too early to talk about prevention. We are seeing more and more headlines around younger and younger ages, whether that is accidental consumption, right? So if there is fentanyl in the home, of course, it's easier to start using, but also accidental. Um, and we are seeing more cases of cannabis overdose. Now, that's not a deadly overdose, that's just a real bad time, but very uncomfortable, very unpleasant for little kids, particularly around gummies. Some of the packaging around edibles are very convincing knockoffs of very popular things like Lucky Charms and Skittles. Smaller kids are not always able to discern that, but we try and provide more education about parents of keeping it up and out of reach. that are locked up, reducing access. So if you felt like this was helpful, you want to know more information, here at Plymouth State, we offer a variety of courses in the clinical mental health counseling, which is also home to school counselors, school psychologists. We do have a concentration in addictions treatment. I teach addictions and related disorders. There is a follow-up course, addictions and treatment modalities. We also have classes in our social work program and a sociology program. If you're looking for more hands-on, what can I print out? What can I give out? SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, has a wealth of information, and they break it down into age groups so that it is age appropriate and a language that is more geared to what they're looking for. And the National Institute on Drug Abuse also provides a lot of really great information. Here are my references. Slides will be made available so that those are all hyperlinked and easy to get direct. And what questions I left over?
Well, thank you so much for the presentation today. For one, are thinking about, do I let my children go out of the house? But anyway, or let them eat anything I don't produce. But thank you so much for your time. We don't seem to have any more questions that I have seen. I'm just still looking over here. Yeah. So I don't see any additional questions. Again, thank you so much for the presentation today. Again, just a reminder for everyone, if you enjoyed this presentation or are interested in technology or issues around technology, we just ask you watch those email and register for our next talk on October 23rd at 4 p.m. Again, thank you so much, April. Thank you to all who attended, and you should see an email in your boxes shortly, again, with the slide deck and those continuing education units. So that will be provided as well, I do believe. Thank you so much. We will see you later.
Thank you.